8,000 Mongols rode into Europe and ran straight into an army more than 3 times their size. 3 days later, the Polish prince was dead, his head on a spear, and Europe's finest knights were scattered across the fields. The strangest part, the Mongols never came to conquer Poland. So why wipe out one of the strongest armies the West could put together and then just disappear? In this video, we'll break it all down. Welcome to Heroic History, the channel where we dive into the battles that shape the world. If you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss more epic stories like this one. Stick around because you'll see the one single trick that broke the Knights' Code and turned Europe's pride into panic. Let's find out. When Genghis Khan died, a lot of people thought the Mongol storm would fade. His son, Ogedei, took the throne, and at first it might have looked like he was just sitting back enjoying what his father had built. But he wasn't content with simply inheriting power. He had something bigger in mind. Instead of letting the Mongols remain just a nomadic war machine, Ogedei started shaping them into a more organized, wealthy state without losing an ounce of their fierce spirit. He built supply systems, created courier networks that stretched across continents, and enforced discipline so tight that even stealing a handful of grain could get you executed. And under his rule, the Mongol tide rolled forward into China, through Central Asia, all the way to the Middle East, and even touching the edges of Europe. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. By 1237, Genghis's grandson, Batu Khan, set his sights on Europe. He didn't just come raiding, he launched a full-scale campaign. His armies stormed through Volga, Bulgaria, seized the Crimean Peninsula, and crushed the Alans. For the first time, Europe was feeling the full weight of Mongol dominance. Then came 1238. Batu's armies marched on Vladimir, and one by one Rus's cities fell. Towns burned, populations scattered, and only a few places like Novgorod and Kiev escaped by bending the knee. But this was only the warm-up. The real storm was still coming, and it'll look like a different kind of war. By late 1240, the Mongols were getting ready to drive even deeper into Europe, setting their sights on Poland and Hungary. This wasn't some wild two-front gamble. It was a calculated campaign. Subutai took charge of the overall strategy, while Batu Khan led in the field, all backed by strict logistics and a lightning-fast courier network. That system made sure their armies stayed in sync no matter how far apart they were. Riders could cover huge distances in days, passing updates between Poland and Hungary. So Subutai always knew exactly what was happening on both fronts. Hungary was the big prize. Whoever controlled the Pannonian Plain and the Carpathian passes basically held the main highways of trade and war between East and West. A perfect launch pad into the rest of Europe. But before they could strike, they had to secure their flank. That meant hitting Poland hard, knocking out any local armies that might attack their rear while the main force marched south. Historians still argue about some of the details, like how many troops were really involved, what each column was aiming for, and why the Mongols pulled back later. But most agree on the bigger picture. Hungary was the real target, and Poland was the roadblock that had to be smashed out of the way. At first, envoys went to negotiate, but Duke Henry of Poland and King Bela of Hungary had no interest in talking. They captured the messengers. And in that moment, diplomacy died. The clock was ticking. From a distance, 13th century Europe might look like a land of castles and knights, but up close, it was politically shattered. Kingdoms were divided. Local lords ruled like little bosses on their own turf, and alliances often fell apart the moment a king died or someone's interests shifted. In a continent tangled up in squabbles and power struggles, the Mongols hardly registered as a real threat. The feudal system was so fractured that building any lasting authority was like trying to herd cats. And when war came, Europe didn't field professional armies. Instead, its backbone was feudal levies, farmers and peasants, sometimes even prisoners, rounded up by their lords. They were poorly equipped, pulled together for a single campaign, and then sent home to tend the fields. These troops lacked training, discipline on the march, and the endurance to fight long campaigns. Even the knights weren't a guarantee. Their loyalty was shaky at best. If a knight chose not to answer his lord's call to arms, who was going to make him? On paper, Europe had heavyweights like the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope, who could have rallied a defense. But during the turbulent decades of the 1220s to 1240s, they were too busy fighting each other to organize any real united front. The result was a chaotic patchwork of kingdoms, always ready to splinter when a ruler passed away, and his lands were carved up by heirs. It didn't matter if you were as powerful as Charlemagne. Within a generation or two, your empire would crumble back into petty chiefdoms. And then there was Henry the Pious, Duke of Silesia. He controlled much of Lesser and Greater Poland and wasn't just another noble. Henry was ambitious, a sharp strategist with dreams of wearing a crown one day. He worked hard to strengthen his principality and stood as one of Poland's most powerful figures. But even a strong leader like Henry couldn't change the bigger picture. When the Mongols came crashing in like a storm, fast, relentless, and disciplined, Europe's fragmentation left him exposed. Duke Henry the Pious was in a tough bind, staring down a ruthless enemy. He knew he needed time for allies to arrive, so, at first, he tried every trick he could to stall the Mongol advance. But by April 9th, the pressure was unbearable. From inside his castle, with maybe 6,000 to 7,000 men, though some sources claim more, Henry realized he couldn't wait for a siege. Starvation would finish them off long before the Mongols did. With no real way to retreat, he made a bold call: march out and meet them in open battle. At Legnica, he gathered what he could. His army looked more like a patchwork quilt than a professional force, somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 men, depending on the source. The problem, most weren't trained soldiers at all. Many were just farmers, pressed into service and carrying little more than tools from their fields. Reinforcements came from Moravia under the Margrave Sudislav, and there was a glimmer of hope from about 70 French Templars, elite knights, heavily armed and disciplined. The real backbone was Henry's Silesian knights and a handful of mercenaries. But the bulk of his troops were poorly equipped levies, and he had only a thin layer of real cavalry to rely on. You've probably heard the old story that the Teutonic Knights fought at Legnica. It's one of those myths that's been told for centuries, but it doesn't hold up. The Romantic version talks about Hospitallers and Teutonic Knights charging in to save the day. But historian Peter Jackson and other scholars point out that it was really just the Templars, and not even many of them. Records suggest no more than 68 to 88 men, a far cry from the grand legends of a mighty crusader host riding to Henry's aid. When it came to weapons, European knights leaned on the classics, swords and spears, but they carried plenty of backups too. Daggers, axes, hammers, even spades, all made their way onto the battlefield. The Polish cavalry was kitted out much the same way as their Western cousins. Their swords usually ran between 80 and 120 centimeters long, weighing in at about 1 to 1.8 kilos. Their spears were even more intimidating, stretching 3.5 to 4.5 millimeters, with sharp, angular tips built to punch through armor. For protection, Polish knights layered up. They started with gambesons, thick padded jackets worn under the armor. Then came brigandines and scale armor covered with small overlapping plates. Eventually they graduated to chainmail hauberks, which offered a nice balance of flexibility and defense. Duke Henry himself had some of the best gear around. He reinforced his chainmail with iron plates and topped it off with a grand helmet so flashy people said you could spot it from miles away. On the field, Henry's tactics were pretty straightforward. He put his knights and squires in the center with infantry guarding the flanks. Archers and crossbowmen fired off a few rounds to soften the enemy, and then the cavalry would surge forward in a full-on charge. But here's the thing. Medieval battles almost never went according to plan. Lose control for even a moment, and the whole thing could flip into chaos. One minute you're pressing the attack, the next you're in a stampede of men running for their lives. On the other side, Orda and Khadan, two Mongol commanders, were closing in with about 10,000 cavalry. Some medieval sources throw around numbers like 100,000 Mongols, but let's be real, that would have been a logistical nightmare in the 13th century. With limited supply lines and infrastructure, supporting an army that big just wasn't possible. The real punch came from their diversionary force. Maybe one or two Tumans. These Mongol horse archers were a tactical marvel. They'd sweep in like a storm, loosing arrows in rapid volleys, then peel away so fast it looked like they were running scared. But that was the trick. Make the enemy think they were fleeing, then snap the trap shut. It was the same kind of move Hannibal pulled off at Cannae centuries earlier. Wear the enemy down with pressure. Lure them out of formation, and when they're stretched too thin and off balance, slam them from the flanks or rear with devastating speed. And the Mongols weren't just quick, they were coordinated. Commanders picked high ground to watch the fight, signaling with flags and relaying orders down the chain to their Noyan. Compare that to European knights, who often just thundered forward in one big charge with little real coordination. Even their armies were built differently. Outfitting a single European knight could take a whole village working to pay for armor, weapons, and horses. The Mongols, on the other hand, were battle-ready by nature. Growing up on the steppe meant every man was an archer from childhood, and their tough little horses thrived on sparse grass with almost no care. That made them mobile, self-sufficient, and perfectly suited for long campaigns far from home. To spread chaos and seize the upper hand, Khadan and Orda made a bold move. They split their already small army into raiding parties. On the surface it looked insane. Divide your strength, risk being picked apart. But the Mongols thrived on speed and surprise, and this gamble was about to pay off in fire and blood. Khadan himself rode straight toward Krakow. Villages burned in his wake, homes were looted, terrified peasants scattered into the woods. Fear traveled faster than his horsemen. And then came a moment Krakow still remembers. As the city panicked, legend says a lone trumpeter climbed a tower and sounded the alarm. His notes cut through the chaos until a Mongol arrow cut him down mid-song. That sudden silence still echoes today. From there, the Mongols stormed across Poland like a wildfire. By February 1241, they had taken cities like Lublin and Sandomierz. Then they split their forces again, driving north and south at once. By the end of the month, Krakow itself was a ghost town, its people hiding in the forest. On March 24th, Khadan set it ablaze, turning Poland's proud capital into nothing but ashes. Yet the city never forgot its trumpeter. Even now, every day, a trumpeter plays from the cathedral tower, but the tune always stops abruptly in memory of the man who fell to that arrow. But Orda wasn't finished. He pushed on to Wrocław. When he arrived, the townsfolk had already fled into their fortress, leaving the city deserted. Orda tried to besiege it, waiting for Khadan to catch up. And then came the news that changed everything. Scouts reported that Duke Henry the Pious was gathering an army at Legnica, and worse, King Wenceslaus of Bohemia was marching to join him. If those two forces united, the Mongols' momentum could collapse overnight. Khadan had to act fast. He abandoned the siege, sent an urgent call to order, and turned his army toward Legnica. The clash that followed would decide whether the Mongols could keep their reign of terror rolling through Europe. The battlefield was a wide-open plain bordered by small rivers, a perfect stage for the showdown between Duke Henry and the Mongols. Henry split his forces into 5 sections, mixing cavalry and foot soldiers. It gave him reserves to fall back on, but it also blunted his first strike. Still, he knew he had to be ready if the Mongols pulled their favorite trick, pretending to retreat, only to whip around and smash into their pursuers. And if that trick worked again, Henry's whole army could unravel before the real fight even began. On the front line, Henry placed men from across Europe, seasoned knights side by side with local farmers and miners who had been rushed into service. Leading them was Count Boleslav of Moravia, known as the Bald, with Moravian knights, Teutonic knights, and miners from Zlotorija and Legnica. But the question hung in the air: could farmers and miners really hold against the finest horsemen in the world? Behind them stood the Polish knights from Krakow and Opole. Then another division of hardened Teutonic knights. Sulisław led the next line, with knights from Krakow, Sandomierz, Wielkopolska, and Silesia. The third division was commanded by Mieszko II, the fat Duke of Opole and Ratibor, and anchoring the fourth were Teutonic veterans under Popo von Osterna, Grand Master of the Order. Henry also kept his own Silesian knights and a few mercenaries in reserve, though historians argue whether the Teutonic Order counted as a full line or not. On paper, Henry had the numbers, but the cracks in his formation were already there. Across the plain, the Mongols stuck with the playbook that had carried them from Asia into Europe, the deadly Chetau formation. They spread their light cavalry and horse archers wide, creating a vast killing ground. And while Henry's men braced for impact, the Mongols were setting the trap they had sprung on countless enemies before. The clash began with thunder. The first line of Polish cavalry lowered their lances and charged headlong into the Mongol vanguard. Against all odds, they broke through, forcing the horsemen back. For a moment, hope rippled through Duke Henry's troops. Farmers, miners, and seasoned knights alike felt it in their bones. Maybe, just maybe, victory was within reach. For a heartbeat, it looked like Henry's men might actually pull off the impossible. Watching the Mongols reel from the blow, Henry made his move. He ordered the rest of his cavalry forward, betting everything on momentum. Hooves thundered across the plain, Polish knights driving hard into the enemy lines. The Mongols fell back again, retreating faster now, and the Polish riders pressed the chase, convinced they had their enemies on the run. But in chasing victory too soon, Henry may have set his army on the path to ruin. As the knights surged ahead, they left their infantry far behind. The tight order of battle broke apart, and that was when the Mongols struck, not with arrows or blades, but with a trick of the mind. A Mongol rider, perfectly fluent in Polish, shouted out across the din, "Run!" The word cut like a knife. Panic rippled through the cavalry ranks, men suddenly unsure if their comrades were breaking. Horses pulled back, lines faltered, and confusion spread like wildfire. In an instant, triumph twisted into terror. From the rear, Duke Henry watched in horror. Seeing his knights hesitate, stumble, and scatter, he cried out in despair, "Gorze nam, Stawo! We are in a bad spot!" His words carried the weight of a man who understood just how fast the tide of battle could turn. But Henry wasn't done yet. Refusing to let his men break, he rode out himself, rallying the frightened soldiers. His courage steadied them, and for a brief time, order returned to the Polish lines. Knights reformed, shields locked, and they pushed back against the Mongol pressure. Would Henry hold his army together, or watch them scatter across the field? Order, watching from the Mongol side, knew exactly what to do. He wasn't going to let Henry stand last. With a single command, Mongol riders galloped through the tall grass surrounding the plain, torches in hand. In moments, flames roared to life. The dry stalks lit like kindling, and soon thick choking smoke rolled across the battlefield. The Christian knights could hardly breathe, let alone see. The stench of burning grass and sweat filled their lungs, and the smoke turned the battlefield into a nightmare. And just as the Polish forces steadied, the Mongols revealed a weapon no knight's armor could stop. The Mongol horsemen didn't wait. With the battlefield already cloaked in smoke, they loosed a storm of arrows into the disoriented Polish cavalry. The riders, blinded and choking, could barely hold their lines as shafts rained down from every direction. Horses screamed, knights toppled, and what had once been a surge of confidence dissolved into sheer confusion. But this was only the beginning of Henry's nightmare. On the flanks, the situation was even worse. The armored corps of Henry's army had pushed too far ahead, leaving the peasants and levies, farmers with little more than axes or spades, completely exposed. The Mongols swept down on them like hawks on frightened prey. They broke instantly, cut down in the chaos, their retreat turning into a massacre. Now the fate of the entire army rested on fragile lines that couldn't possibly hold. Amid the carnage, Duke Henry fought desperately to rally his men, but the Mongols were closing in from every side. Then, in a cruel twist of fate, a spear found its mark, sliding beneath his arm, where the armor left a vulnerable gap. He reeled in the saddle, blood pouring before crashing to the ground. Mongol warriors rushed forward, overwhelming him in seconds. 2 arrows pierced his body before they dragged him away from his knights, who could do nothing to save him. And then came the moment that sealed not just the battle, but Henry's destiny. The victors wasted no time. They stripped him of his insignia, ensuring his body could not easily be recognized. His lifeless form was left on the dirt, while his head was severed and raised high as a gruesome trophy. Some chroniclers claimed he was still alive when they took him, beheaded only after the fighting stopped. Others believed he was killed on the spot. Either way, his fate was sealed in blood and humiliation. What the Mongols did next sent shockwaves across all of Europe. Knights who tried to rescue him were cut down. Those who attempted to flee were hunted down, captured, and beheaded. The battlefield of Legnica became a slaughterhouse, its silence broken only by the clash of steel, the cries of the dying, and the thunder of Mongol hooves pressing ever forward. The Mongols wasted no time turning their victory into a spectacle. They lifted Duke Henry's severed head high on a spear and marched it to the gates of Legnica, hoping to terrify the defenders into surrender. The message was clear: resist, and this would be your fate. But the Polish garrison refused to bow. The city held firm even in the face of such a horrifying sight. But even this brutal display wasn't the end of Henry's story. Eventually, the grim trophy was sent back to Batu Khan's main camp, leaving Henry's widow Anna to face the heartbreaking task of identifying her husband's remains. His body, stripped of armor and clothing, was barely recognizable. Yet Anna noticed one unmistakable detail. Henry had 6 toes on his left foot. That small, peculiar mark confirmed it was truly him. He was buried in the Church of St. James, later transferred to St. Vincent's in Wrocław. Centuries later, when the grave was opened in 1832, the 6 toes were still there, though the skull had long since vanished. And it was a single strange detail that proved the body was truly Henry's. The true scale of the slaughter at Legnica is still debated. Chroniclers wrote that the Mongols tallied their own dead in a grisly fashion by cutting off the right ears of fallen soldiers. Some say they filled 9 sacks with those trophies. Whether that number is accurate or not, it shows just how fierce the fighting must have been. But their victory wasn't as simple as it looked on the surface. Legnica and the wider 1241 campaign forced a long, slow rethink in Europe about what war actually looked like. The Mongols didn't win because their warriors were somehow stronger or braver than European knights. They won because their system was better. At Legnica and elsewhere, they showed how to pull different tools together. Light horse archers who harassed and tricked the enemy, heavy cavalry who delivered the knockout punch, and even engineers who brought siege weapons on campaign. To European eyes, this was shocking. They were used to battles decided by a single heavy cavalry charge. That shock planted a seed. Over the next centuries, European armies began to shift away from depending only on the knightly charge. Commanders started to value combined arms, archers, crossbowmen, disciplined infantry, and eventually artillery, all working together. It wasn't an overnight change, but the Mongols showed how deadly coordination could be. Technology played its part too. The Mongols operated as a bridge across Eurasia, and their campaigns helped carry ideas with them. One of those ideas was gunpowder. They had already seen Chinese fire lances and explosives through the networks created by conquest and trade. That knowledge trickled west. By the late 1200s and early 1300s, Europeans were writing down recipes for gunpowder. It didn't transform battle right away, but it was the beginning of a shift that would eventually bring down the dominance of armored knights and castles alike. By the late Middle Ages, we start seeing more permanent armies, paid infantry, and tactics designed around teamwork instead of individual duels. Of course, we also have to clear up some myths. Medieval chroniclers loved big numbers, and they often inflated them for dramatic effect. Stories about 100,000 knights falling to the Mongols at Legnica almost certainly exaggerate the scale. Modern historians argue both sides probably fielded far smaller forces. But the real point isn't the size of the armies. It's how one side's organization and tactics let them punch far above their weight. So how should we remember Legnica? Was it a brilliant Mongol masterstroke or a tragic European miscalculation where knights rode straight into a fight they weren't ready for? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with a friend who loves history as much as you do. Thanks for sticking with me until the end, and we'll see you in tomorrow's video.